A number of people have asked more directly about your interest in Eastern religions. Aidan Bruton, for example, asked if spirituality has always been important to you. Are your parents Christian, and how did you become interested and involved with Eastern religions?
Well, I come from a family that wasn't overtly religious in any way whatsoever, but I had an undeniable childlike belief in a God, which I held on to for the whole of my childhood. I began to question that belief at some point and wanted to look further into it, and that was the start of quite a long and obsessive journey for me. Ultimately, I felt I was leaning more towards the Buddhist practice because it was so clear-cut, so well-defined. It was pure practice. But at the time in my life when I actively sought out a teacher, I came across teachers from a Hindu background. This happened to me on a number of occasions, and ultimately that has played a large influence. It's developed my own practice. My own practice, I would now say, is amalgam of certain Buddhist approaches and the devotional aspect of Hinduism. But it is all directed towards my teacher. So I follow now what I would call a devotional path, Bhakti Yoga, which is to surrender to my teacher's will, which is a difficult thing to do, because in the West particularly we're taught to let go of one's own will is to let go entirely, you know. So we're talking about an act of surrender, and an act of surrender in this context isn't a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's something that's ongoing with every moment. It has to be reaffirmed in every moment. Otherwise we'll just slip back into old ways of thinking, habitual ways of thinking and acting. So it becomes a form of meditation. And that is the practice that I subscribe to.
At what point in your career as a musician did this interest in meditative religious practice become apparent? I mean, it began to
really show itself after the breakup of the band. So, 92, 93, around that time. Oh, sorry, 82, 83.
We've had many people asking questions about your various collaborations, because obviously you have worked with a lot of people, and we've already spoken about that. One particular one from someone, again, called B. Hamill, asking about collaboration with Scott Walker. What became of that?
Well, nothing, obviously. I originally sent a composition to Scott just to see if we'd be interested in recording it. It was actually Ride, which we now hear for the first time on Everything and Nothing. I felt that it would have suited Scott's vocal style, and he responded well and asked to meet up. So we did, and we got to talking about recording albums, and the initial idea of recording one track just evolved into recording multiple albums, you know. For some reason I never fully believed that this was going to take place. But if I could be in any way of assistance of helping Scott get back into the studio and recording again, I thought that's fine by me, you know. I needn't be involved in the project. So I was basically there for that purpose, I felt, until such a time as events took over and he was finally liberated from the contract that he was in at that point in time, and was able to move on and record on his own, you know, without any assistance.
Somebody who's rejoiced under the name of Joe sends a question saying, David, you've collaborated with a great many wonderful artists over the last 20 years or more. Can you recall any personal favourite recording sessions or appearances where something clicked and made it particularly rewarding?
or Heartbeat comes straight to mind, because that was the piece that brought Ingrid and I together. So that piece is immensely important in my life. You know, I mean, Ingrid and I got together about 2 weeks prior to the actual session, and fought tooth and nail for the 2 weeks that we were initially together, because I think we felt that something was about to happen. We felt the forces drawing us together, and we fought it like crazy. But by the time we headed into the studio to record the track, we'd totally succumbed to one another. And I just remember the 2 days of of session work that we did on the Heartbeat track. Basically, the backing track was already there. Ruichi had already recorded that, and I brought in Frizzell and then added my own vocal and Ingrid's vocal. And it was just one of those pieces that just fell together so beautifully.
And Ingrid was going to be contributing words, or
she was contributing vocals.
So she was singing your words?
Yes, and speaking.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'd written a part for spoken word, but I hadn't found the right artist to perform the part, and this was part of the story that brought us together. She sent a copy of her album to me, and I'd just completed writing the song, and so to hear that voice was to know immediately, you know, who the appropriate person was for the song, and that's what drew us together, or one of the many things that appears to have pulled us together.
Any other key moments, collaborations?
Well, you know, I really did enjoy the the sessions I did with John Hassel on Brilliant Trees, and with Holger, same period. Very interesting chemistry there between the three of us. And particularly the intensity that Hassel brought to the sessions really brought those pieces alive for me. And it was wonderful to get that affirmation that to be able to make that connection, as I was saying earlier, between a certain voice and a composition, that it was going to work. I was very nervous of the fact that after breaking up Japan, I would be entering a studio with session musicians. You know, you work with a band for a number of years. Everybody in that band is committed to the outcome of a composition, of a recording. So they give their all. And the notion of going into the studio with session musicians that just kind of swan in and lay down a solo and swan out again, it didn't appeal to me at all. So the success of those sessions with that caliber of artists, John Hassel, Holger Chukai, and Ruichi, and all the rest, set in motion, you know, what was to be a method of working for me for the years to come.
Presumably the collaboration with, well, the long-term relationship really with Rishi Sakamoto must have been very important too.
Yes, yeah, no doubt. And particularly in absence of a band now. We share a common vocabulary, which is so important. And of course it needn't be verbal, it's just the way we respond to one another in the studio. And that's very rare. I'm finding it to be a very rare thing. So, you know, Ruichi is something of a touchstone for me. When we go into the studio together, we can immediately move further and further afield, you know, in terms of the input into the particular piece we're working on. We don't have to establish or re-establish that common ground. It's taken for granted, just as it would be with a group of musicians you've been working with for many years. So he's the only person in my life right now that I share that with. So I would say he's an incredibly important collaborator.
None of the collaborators, or none of the collaborators I can think of really correspond to the description of rock. They all seem to, neither do they fall particularly neatly into the jazz area. They seem to occupy some third space. Do you have any idea why that should be, or what that space is?
No, I don't think I could elucidate on that. I just enjoy people's work that has this very personal element, a very personal voice. It doesn't really matter what genre they're working in. Normally they tend to be working in the outer perimeters of any given genre, or crossover. I mean, hybrids are very interesting to me also. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to them. I hear something of a very personal nature in their work that that pulls me to it. Outside of that,
here's a good question from a lady called Nicola. You've lived all over the world, she says, and absorbed influences from so many places. Which place has been the most influential? And do you ever long for the British shores? I suppose she means Britain by that. I don't mean she imagines sitting in a deck chair at Clacton or something.
I haven't lived all over the world. I've lived in Britain, I've lived in America. I've travelled extensively. It's hard to say what has been. I mean, living in England has obviously been enormously influential. How could it be otherwise? I mean, I lived here for the first 34 years of my life or whatever. So formative and very important. Moving to America, that move coincided with so many other eventful events happening in my life. So there was the period when I moved to the States, and about the 5 years that on from there, very eventful, very enriching period in my life. It's very hard for me to say what aspect was the most influential, or how has living in America influenced the work, because there are so many other factors coming into play. It's very hard for me to separate them all. You know, there's meeting Ingrid, marriage, moving to America, having children, meeting spiritual teachers and guides, and then there is America itself. You know, but it's just part and parcel of a life that's lived. I can't separate all those different entities.
So place is not in and of itself particularly something that you'd
That's right.
draw
That's
out.
true. Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people, myself possibly included, wondered whether you might have, as you did for a while, lived in California because of California's strong meditative Buddhist traditions.
Well, I was drawn there because of there were certain teachers there that I wanted to be close to, but from the Hindu culture. There was a couple of ashrams there that I was interested in living in closer proximity to. And we benefited from that enormously for the 3 years that we lived there. But for a number of reasons, we felt that we couldn't put roots down there, so ultimately moved on. But to come back to the original question, I do miss Britain. I do miss aspects of European culture in general.
What aspects of European culture? Football, presumably.
Yeah, of course. Let's see. For example, the most obvious one that comes to mind, because I love movies, is that you just do not get enough of I love French movies, French directors, so you just don't get enough of that in the States. You have to actually search them out. So there's certain aspects of the culture that I miss, and a certain nostalgia brings me back. But I recognized a short time ago that America was my home, and that that appeared to be quite sure about that, and so that's why I was able to go back and find a place and begin to put down roots without any uncertainty as to where I should be.
You've lived pretty well all across America, because you've lived in and around the Midwest, you've lived in California, now you're living in New Hampshire.
And I've driven all over it too, a number of times. Any
particular preferences? I mean, America is such a vast place. To talk about as one country is almost a nonsense.
Yes, I know. The landscape in America is so